her daughter in the UK and was turned down and made to go away by the UK Border Force at the Gare du Nord. Will she today be able to return to the Gare du Nord and come safely to the UK?
Yes.
Holding Member Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scunthorpe and Ukraine have deep ties rooted in our steelworks, and we are horrified at what's happening to our Ukrainian friends. Can my right honourable friend confirm that the support that she has just described will stay in place for however long it is needed?
Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very sensible point, of course, because there is a conflict taking place, and the work of the government is absolutely there right now to support the people of Ukraine, and in particular support those that need to come over to our country.
See MacDonald, SNP spokesperson.
Mr. Speaker, not for the first time this weekend, I do have to say I'm struggling to understand what the Home Office is announcing and why it's announcing whatever it is. Can I, for example, ask, what about my constituent who is fleeing Ukraine? Is he able to be accompanied by his mother-in-law, sister-in-law and niece, for example? Again, why not do the simple thing, the just thing, and lift visa restrictions altogether?
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to refer the honourable gentleman to the comments that I've made already.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government should be rightly proud of the action taken to support our police officers, not least through the adoption of Harper's Law due before this House later today. But what more can my right honourable friend do to ensure police officers get all the mental health support they need, as advocated by the Green Ribbon Policing Campaign?
Secretary.
Well, no, my honourable friend is absolutely right in the case that he makes around mental health, and I know he's doing some great work on this as well. So there is a huge amount that we are doing in government, working with Department of Health and Social Care in particular, focusing on mental health support, the TRIM programme and things of that nature. But I know that he's got a particular interest in this, and it's something that I'd like to discuss with him further.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've listened to the Home Secretary's earlier statement with interest, but clarity is needed. I have constituents who have family members in Ukraine, some of them frail and elderly. Can she assure the House that those Ukrainians who wish to join their families in the UK can do so via a third country without being mired in delays and bureaucracy? And can she further guarantee that those refugees will not be ordered to leave the UK after the nominal 12 months have expired?
Well, there are no delays and bureaucracy, as she's already heard me say. And to her last point, yes.
Simon Baines.
Speaker, North Wales Police in my constituency of Clwyd South do an exceptional job in keeping the public safe and tackling crime. Could my right honourable friend comment on plans to recruit and retain the best and brightest to join our police force? And would she join me in praising our local policing initiatives?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to lavish praise on North Wales Police. They do a fantastic job along the coast there, as do all our police officers up and down the country. And I'm pleased to say that we're making enormous progress on our recruitment programme. As I hope he knows, we're well over 11,000 now, and I expect to hit the 20,000 target shortly.
Zara Sultan.
Mr. Speaker, Joe, a constituent, came to Britain in 2001 and served 5 years in the army, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he developed PTSD and served time for drink driving offences. He sought help for PTSD, stopped driving and rebuilt his life. He now has 2 children in Coventry and no connections in Zimbabwe, his birthplace, where he was tortured the last time he was there. But on Wednesday, Joe is set to be deported to Zimbabwe, and I have had no reply from the Minister to my urgent correspondence on this case. So will the Home Secretary step in and stop Joe from being deported from the country he served and where his family lives to a place where he will be at risk of torture?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her question, and it's fair to say that casework inquiries around these matters are treated urgently. It is one that will cross my desk, no doubt, within the coming hours. Of course, this is a flight in question later this week that relates to individuals who have committed very serious criminality, but I will, of course, ensure that the individual case is looked at.
Dr. Jamie Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, does my right honourable friend agree with me that now is the ideal time to review and reform the 32-year-old Computer Misuse Act, as recommended by the ISC's Russia report? And will she meet with me and colleagues to discuss how reforming this legislation could not only help tackle online crime, but unlock our national cyber defence?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And he's absolutely right about the importance of the review of the Computer Misuse Act. Of course, my right honourable friend launched that review last year. There have been a number of very good and important suggestions come forward, which we're currently reviewing. Meanwhile, of course, we continue always to update our approach, including to the National Cyber Security Centre and, more immediately, to the Online Safety Bill.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, in the evidence that the Home Secretary gave to the Home Affairs Select Committee on the 2nd of February, she said that a major obstacle for accepting more people under Operation Warm Welcome for Afghans fleeing the Taliban was the lack of suitable accommodation because of Home Office contracts. The Select Committee has been warning about this for some time, so I think that the Home Secretary has announced a bespoke humanitarian policy for those Ukrainians fleeing. Oh, perhaps she hasn't. I'm sorry, there isn't a statement to clarify that. But what I want to know is, what is she going to do about the lack of accommodation that the Home Office provide for asylum seekers and refugees in this country?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly we are concerned about the lack of suitable accommodation across the United Kingdom in terms of dispersal areas. Of course, that's why we're very keen to sign up new areas to become dispersal areas. I'm pushing my own council, and as I've already referred to in this session, there's 31 out of 32 areas in Scotland that could soon do with signing up as well.
Mr. Speaker, Dorset Police is at the bottom of the funding league table for police forces, being 40th out of the 41 forces, and we continue to battle issues of rural crime, including county lines drug gangs. Will my right honourable friend commit to ensuring that Dorset gets its fair share so that we can get the more police officers that I want to see, particularly the rural crime police team, double, and I know those aspirations are shared by our Police and Crime Commissioner?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've committed before, and I'm happy to commit again to the honourable gentleman, that before the end of the Parliament we will produce a new funding formula to ensure that his constituency gets exactly what he deserves, as indeed should he.
Don't have it.
Does the Home Secretary accept that many members of this House are dismayed that she didn't make a statement in the normal way, so she could have been questioned in the normal way? And does she further accept that this is not just disrespectful to the House of Commons, it shows a lack of real concern for those desperate people escaping Ukraine?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I completely reject the latter point that the Honourable Lady has made, and naturally I will always be happy to return to the House to take questions.
Back there.
Mr. Speaker, constituents in Tatton are increasingly concerned about the growing number and range of online fraud and scams and the ability for Action Fraud to be able to deal with them. Many of those crimes originate outside the UK and some from hostile states like Russia. What is the Minister doing to counter that?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she's absolutely right, and we share her constituents' concern. We are looking constantly to upgrade and improve Action Fraud, and also I'd encourage her constituents to carry on reporting these incidents, because her constituents and the rest of our constituents together, their forwarding of dodgy emails to report@phishing.gov.uk has so far led to 73,000 scams being removed.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Home Secretary publish her review into the Tier 1 gold-plated visas? Will she suspend all Tier 1 visas for people who have connections with the Putin regime? And will she also look into the veracity of the applications for British citizenship by Russian oligarchs who are connected with Putin?
I think the honourable gentleman knows my view and position on this, and of course the answer is yes.
Final question, Ben Everett.
Thank you. Another young life has been tragically lost to a knife in Milton Keynes. Will the Minister agree with me that, as well as record numbers of police on the streets, we need the courts and the CPS to work with the police to ensure that there are real deterrents to carrying a knife on our streets?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. I'm very sorry to see the crime that took place in his constituency. As he will know, the fight against knife crime is in the forefront of the government's priorities, and alongside, as he said, both deterrent sentencing and assertive and extensive policing, we do need to work on those long-term solutions to turning young people's lives away from crime. And I'm very pleased that I was able to visit the Thames Valley VRU just last year to look at the extensive work they're doing on putting exactly those kind of programmes in place.
We now come to the statement from the Foreign Secretary. I call Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I want to update the House on our support for Ukraine in the face of Putin's premeditated, pre-planned and barbaric invasion. Ukraine has suffered horrific attacks. Missiles and airstrikes have torn through apartment blocks. Tanks have rolled into once peaceful cities. Innocent people, including children, have lost their lives. The situation is fluid, but as of today, Putin has not taken any major cities. Their advance has been slowed by Ukraine's fierce resistance. Putin's invasion is not proceeding to plan. He expected to take cities quickly. He expected Ukraine to retreat, and he expected the West to be divided. Instead, his forces were met by the heroism of President Zelensky and the resolute determination of the Ukrainian people. He has been met by a united West, together with our friends around the world, and we have taken decisive action. Today, we have acted with the US, the EU, Japan and Canada to cut Russia's central bank off from our markets. The ruble has fallen by over 40% as a result. As much as $250 billion have been wiped off the Russian stock market, and today their stock market is closed. The EU, Germany, Sweden and others are following our lead in providing defensive weapons to Ukraine. Germany has frozen Nord Stream 2. Putin has been confounded by our collective response. That is why he is resorting to more and more extreme rhetoric. But of course, the situation remains dire. The government and people of Ukraine are facing a continued onslaught. The days ahead are likely to prove tougher still. The UK and our allies will have to undergo some economic hardship as a result of our sanctions. But our hardships are nothing compared to those endured by the people of Ukraine. Casualty numbers are rising, and over 300,000 people have already been displaced. This is a struggle for Ukraine's freedom and self-determination, but it is also a struggle for freedom and democracy everywhere, and for a survival of a Europe whole and free. We feel a particular responsibility, as the UK is a signatory to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which provided Ukraine with security guarantees. This premeditated invasion, in violation of international law and multiple international commitments, cannot succeed. Putin must lose. We are doing everything we can to stop him and to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We will do this by backing Ukraine against unjustified aggression, by degrading the Russian economy and stopping it funding Putin's war machine, and by isolating Putin on the world stage. First of all, we're backing Ukraine with defensive weapons, humanitarian aid and economic support. The UK was the first European nation to send defensive weapons to the country. Those weapons are being used today to halt Russian tanks and defend Ukrainian towns and cities. Our latest consignment of defensive support left Brize Norton over the weekend. We're also leading on humanitarian support. Yesterday, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced a further $40 million of humanitarian aid. This will provide Ukrainians with access to basic necessities and vital medical supplies. We call on Russia to enable humanitarian access and safe passage for civilians to flee the violence. The UK is also supporting Ukraine's economy, including through $100 million of ODA and guarantees of up to $500 million in development bank loans. Secondly, we are cutting off funding for Putin's war machine. We're coming together with the US, the G7 and the EU to take further decisive steps. We've been joined by Australia, Singapore, Switzerland and many more. There is a growing list of countries who are determined that this aggression cannot stand. We've agreed many Russian banks will be removed from the SWIFT system, kicking them out of international finance. This is the first step towards a total SWIFT ban. Our collective action against Russia's central bank will prevent them from deploying their international reserves to mitigate the impact of our sanctions. We're also launching a joint task force to hunt down the assets of oligarchs hit by our sanctions. The UK is proud to lead by example. We've already put in place the largest package of sanctions in our history. We've sanctioned Putin and Lavrov, Russia's defence industry, and a growing list of oligarchs. We've approved asset freezes on several Russian banks. We're banning Russian airlines and private jets from our airspace. But we are determined to go much, much further. We want a situation where they can't access their funds, their trade can't flow, their ships can't dock, and their planes can't land. Today, I can inform the House I will be laying 2 new pieces of sanctions legislation. The first introduces a set of new powers against Russia's financial sector. It includes powers to prevent Russian banks from clearing payments in sterling. With over 50% of Russian trade denominated in dollars or sterling, our coordinated action with the United States will damage Russia's ability to trade with the world. And as soon as this legislation comes into force, we will apply it to Sberbank, Russia's largest bank. I will also be imposing a full asset freeze on 3 further banks: VEB, Russia's National Development Bank; Sovcombank, the 3rd largest privately owned financial institution in Russia; and Ozkriter, one of Russia's largest commercial banks. We will bring in a full asset freeze on all Russian banks in days, looking to coordinate with our allies. This same legislation will prevent the Russian state from raising debt here, and it will isolate all Russian companies, that's over 3 million businesses, from accessing UK capital markets. Global giants like Gazprom will no longer be able to issue debt or equity in London. The second piece of legislation will ban exports to Russia across a range of critical sectors. This includes high-end technological equipment such as microelectronics, marine and navigation equipment. This will blunt Russia's military-industrial capabilities and act as a drag on Russia's economy for years to come. I appreciate the consequences of this step for British people and British businesses operating in Russia, and the Department of International Trade and the Treasury will offer advice and guidance to affected UK businesses. My consular staff will continue to support British nationals in Russia, as well as those in Ukraine. And we will keep ratcheting up our response. More legislation will follow in coming weeks in sanctioning Russian-occupied territories in the Donbass, extending more sanctions to Belarus, and limiting Russian deposits in UK banks. We will continue working through our hit list of oligarchs, focusing on their houses, their yachts, and every aspect of their lives. In addition, we will be introducing the Economic Crime Bill tomorrow. My Right Honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will be setting out more in the next statement in the House. This is all about flushing out the oligarchs' dirty money from the United Kingdom. And we will continue to work with our G7 allies to cut off the Russian economy and cut the free world's dependence on Russian gas, depriving Putin of his key source of revenue. Finally, we're leading the diplomatic effort to ensure there is a chorus of condemnation against President Putin. In the OSCE, a key part of the European security architecture, 45 countries condemn Russia by name. At the UN Security Council on Friday, over 80 UN members voted for or co-sponsored a resolution condemning Russia's aggression. Russia stood alone in opposing it. Putin is isolated. No one is willing to back his war of choice. In recent days, I've spoken to my counterparts in more than 20 countries around the world. Yesterday, I met G7 foreign ministers, where we were joined by Ukraine's brave foreign minister, my friend Dmytro Kuleba. Everyone is clear Putin must lose, and we will carry on increasing the pressure until he does. We have all seen Ukraine's determination to fight. Putin's war could end up lasting for months and years. So I say to our Ukrainian friends, we are with you. In Britain and around the world, we're prepared to suffer economic sacrifices to support you. However long it takes, we will not rest until Ukraine's sovereignty is restored. I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement and for the continued briefing that she continues to give me on Privy Council terms. We have all been inspired by the gallant and tenacious actions of Ukrainians in defence of their country. This is true courage under fire. President Zelensky has epitomised the bravery, the dignity and resolve of a nation fighting back, fighting for values that we all share, for democracy, for freedom and for the rule of law. The Foreign Secretary is right when she says that Putin's invasion is not so far going to plan. But will she agree with me that we must not let our focus slip for even a second? We will continue to stand united with our allies and partners, supporting Ukraine and opposing this outrageous campaign of aggression. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had the honour of meeting with Ukraine's ambassador with the Shadow Defence Secretary. He thanked all sides of this House for the united opposition that we have shown to Vladimir Putin's illegal war and the support we continue to show for Ukrainian sovereignty. Putin is not only facing a united West, he is facing a truly united kingdom. Together, we have enacted sanctions that are having a strong effect. The ruble has crashed by over 40%. The main borrowing rate is up 20%, and inflation is reportedly hitting around 65% per year. Oligarchs are being frozen out of their bank accounts, and the Central Bank of Russia is being blocked from part of the 640 billion war chest that it holds in foreign reserves. Labour's priority is to cut off Putin's rogue state from our economic system and to undermine his campaign of aggression in Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, we recognise that on the 24th of February, the European security order changed. Our continent faces a transformed strategic context. Our world is at the start of a new era. I pay tribute to the political courage shown by all of our partners, particularly our allies in Germany, who have recognised that by taking the difficult and brave decisions to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons for its fight and to commit to the significant increases in defence spending that this new reality demands. Yesterday, President Putin raised the alert level of Russian nuclear forces. Mr. Speaker, as the 5 nuclear weapons states, including Russia, reaffirmed in January, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Can I ask for her assessment of this decision, given the understandable concern it will have caused amongst the public? Turning to sanctions, we welcome the further steps the government has announced today. The progress made by the UK, the EU and the US on cutting off Russian banks from SWIFT is something Labour has called for some time. The moves to finally clamp down on dirty money, so long demanded by Labour and colleagues across the House, are long overdue. It's regrettable that it's taken this long and a crisis of this nature for action, but we welcome the steps and will study them carefully. But there's still more the government can do. The last time I stood at this dispatch box, I asked what steps the government has taken to ensure members of Russia's legislature, the Duma, can be sanctioned. Still today, I'm waiting for that answer. Similarly, while I welcome the Foreign Secretary's action against Russia's financial sector, the government should go further to ensure sanctions can be placed against Russia's extractive industries, energy industries and technological industries. And we believe that we must ensure that the insurance industry cannot underwrite and de-risk Putin's war. As I said during my last time at the dispatch box, it's vital that these sanctions are broad enough to inflict damage on every aspect of Russia's economy. We welcome the moves that the government have taken to ensure Russia is cut out of the SWIFT banking system, but can the Foreign Secretary explain the dialogue that she's had with our allies about cutting the country out of the Visa MasterCard system too? Finally, can the Foreign Secretary give assurances that Putin will also feel the consequences of his despicable actions in terms of international opportunities available to the country in sports and culture? The diplomatic unity of the West is crucial, but we must also widen the global coalition opposing the war. I pay tribute to the political courage shown by our partners, particularly our allies Germany, who recognise this. But difficult and brave decisions also require further action. Some countries like Kenya have spoken out with clarity and elegance about Putin's imperialism, but others have stayed silent. Some are even allies of the UK and fellow democracies. So can I ask what steps the Foreign Secretary has taken to ensure that the widest possible range of voices speaks up in opposition to this war? Mr. Speaker, as well as commending the bravery of the Ukrainians demanding their country, we must also praise the courage of ordinary Russians taking to the streets of Moscow, in St. Petersburg and beyond, under the threat of repression to show their opposition to this despot. Mr. Speaker, this is the 5th day of fighting. Ukraine is still facing an all-out war from Putin's army. It's a mark of the bravery of Ukraine's forces that neither Kiev nor Kharkiv have fallen. We salute their courage, and this whole House will continue to stand with them.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his statement of unity, and a strong message is going out to Putin and around the world that the United Kingdom is united in our support for Ukraine, and we can see that from the demonstrations. We can see that by the public concern and interest in this appalling act of aggression and invasion that has taken place. Yesterday, I joined a call with the G7 foreign ministers. We agreed that the sanctions we put in place so far are having an impact, but we need to do more. And we need to work in unison, and we need to act in unity. We have also agreed to increase the supply of defensive weapons in Ukraine. And the honourable gentleman is correct. Germany has taken courageous steps. They've transformed their energy policy, they've transformed their defence policy, and we have seen a huge rising, I think, of public opinion right across Europe. But I also want to praise Japan, South Korea, Singapore, which has put sanctions on for the first time. And I and my colleagues in the Foreign Office are putting in calls to foreign ministries around the world. We're encouraging more countries to put on sanctions, more countries to speak out at the UN. The honourable gentleman is right. There are some countries who are democracies who should be standing up against the invasion of a sovereign democracy, and we are making that point to them day and night. But what we are seeing is Putin is completely isolated. There is nobody else backing him up in these international fora, and there is a growing group of countries who are prepared to put sanctions on, who are prepared to supply defensive weapons, and we are leading the charge in bringing those countries on board. On the specific issues he mentioned, we do have a hit list of oligarchs and Duma members that we are working through to sanction as soon as we can. Foreign Office officials are working through the night, and we have extra lawyers in. We've tripled the amount of people in our sanctions department to make this happen. We are looking at more sanctions on the energy industry, the technology industry. We want to see a total ban on SWIFT transactions. We're encouraging our allies across the world to back that. We also want to see a full bank freeze in the coming days. It's vitally important we maintain unity with our allies. There are many countries that are heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas. The UK only has 3% of our energy from oil and gas. Some countries are as high as 90, 100%. So what we have to do is reduce that over time, and that is what we are working on through the G7. I am very pleased that the honourable gentleman has backed the approach we're taking. I want to continue to work cross-party to do all we can to support the brave people of Ukraine and to make sure that Putin loses.
And the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Speaker, I welcome very much my right honourable friend's commitment to be working literally through the weekend, night and day, to get these sanctions right and to get them in place. will she join me in assuring the Russian people that the monies frozen, the money seized, which are, let's face it, stolen very often from them in the first instance, will be held and returned to the Russian people when this criminal conspiracy that laughably calls itself a government falls and they actually have a proper administration to which it can be returned? And will she also join with me in urging many other countries around the world to join together and to create a single fund from which this can be created, a repayment mechanism for the damage done to Ukraine and the rebuilding of Russia in due course?
Well, my honourable friend is right. Our issue is not with the Russian people, many of whom are now protesting against this appalling regime. It is with Putin and his cronies. That is who we're targeting with our hit on oligarchs. And he is right that money should be protected, and I'll look into the idea he's put forward.
Now come to SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm also grateful for sight of the statement, and the SNP is part of the global coalition in defence of Ukraine and international law, and I would commend the Foreign Secretary and our ministers on the openness with which they've dealt with this side of the House. That trust will be reciprocated going forward. This is too serious a time. If anything, I'd urge more. I support the statement. We'll support the sanctions measures as they come forward, but I'd urge more. I'd urge faster ambition, particularly on refugees. The UK needs to waive visas, not flags. The EU has really given the lie to the generosity of the UK's response on refugees by waiving visas for 3 years for all Ukrainian nationals. The UK needs to do the same. And I would appreciate it's not her remit, but I really would urge the government to act on this, because certainly that's the issue that's being raised most with me. Indeed, the EU's response in terms of the civilian protection mechanism and the peace facility dwarf the scale of the UK's response. The EU has acted with one voice. 27 member states are acting together. I really would urge the UK to complement those efforts and match the scale and ambition of the measures that we do support, but we want to see more of. So, some specific questions on sanctions. Tackling the oligarchs, we all agree on that, but what plans are to tackle and target the family members of oligarchs? When we were in Kyiv recently, that was mentioned as a particularly effective way of putting on pressure. I also note that there will be an advice facility for UK businesses impacted by the sanctions. Is there any consideration being given to financial aid for UK businesses hit by these sanctions? Because that seems a morally correct thing to do. And the Foreign Secretary will also be aware that there's reports of a Russian tanker heading for Orkney to pick up oil. Will the measures, the legal powers to impound these vessels, be in place in time for us to do so? Thank you.
Well, I agree with the honourable gentleman that we need to continue to do more on sanctions, and we are working night and day, including with our allies, to get those tougher sanctions, the full ban on SWIFT payments, the full asset freeze on banks, which we want to introduce in the next few days, as well as targeting the oil industry and the gas industry. And that is ultimately the most important thing, because that is what is funding Putin's war machine. On the subject of humanitarian route, my honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has just talked about this in Home Office questions. We're creating a new Ukrainian humanitarian route to enable families of British nationals to come into the United Kingdom. And this will mean an additional 100,000 Ukrainians are able to seek sanctuary in the United Kingdom. On the subject of supporting businesses, the Department of International Trade, through the Export Support Service, will be helping businesses, and my colleague, the International Trade Secretary, will be laying out more details in due course.
Blake Drummond.
The latest announcement that Switzerland and Japan and other democracies are joining to impose sanctions. What more can we do, though, to convince other democracies who have not condemned this atrocity and or implemented sanctions to do the same?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and there is nobody in the world lining up with Vladimir Putin and his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. But we need more democracies, we need more sovereign nations standing up, because we cannot have a world where might is right and international law can just be road rushod over. We at the Foreign Office and ministers across government are making these points to our counterparts around the world. But this is where I think parliamentarians can help. Many people in this House have good contacts with overseas governments, encouraging those governments to stand up, to put sanctions in place. I had a call this morning with some foreign ministers who've never put sanctions in place before but are now considering it. So there are many more who are on the verge of imposing sanctions, and I strongly encourage members across the House to get on the phone to those ministers, to those governments, because this has created global outrage, and we need to see that reflected in complete degradation of the Russian economy.
I'm looking to run this for about an hour. 12 each of the short questions and speedy answers would help all of us. Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for the progress that she's making. I would just ask two questions. It is still unclear to me, and I think to most members of the public, as to whether or not members of the Duma can be sanctioned by this government. Could she clarify that and clear that up for us? And the second thing is, it's not just Russia, but it's jurisdictions like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan that are also complicit and supporting Putin in his endeavours. Is she taking any action to sanction members of those jurisdictions?
Well, the answer is members of the Duma can and will be sanctioned. We're working through the list of members in the same way as we're working through our hit list of oligarchs, and I will look into the issues around Kazakhstan and other nations. We're already sanctioning Belarus, and we are shortly imposing more sanctions on Belarus for their complicity in this abhorrent invasion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed day 5 of the fighting, but the bells of St. Michael in Kiev continue to ring as the Ukrainians thwart the progress of the Russian Red Army. So good on them. Slava Ukraini to our friends in Ukraine. But sanctions are so important, but they will not be enough. Could I urge the Foreign Secretary to see how we can widen the sanctions package internationally? Any sanctions that we impose will be mopped up by Russia's new long-term friend, China. The UN General Assembly is sitting today. Could I urge the UK to put in a resolution on sanctions, which means that China is obliged to follow them along with everybody else?
These sanction package has been agreed across the G7, which represents more than 50% of the global economy. So that is a significant hit on the Russian economy, and it will help degrade the Russian economy over time. The key issue is reducing dependency on oil and gas. And my honourable friend is right that we also need to make sure that there is not simply sanctions leakage into other countries. I did speak to my Chinese counterpart. The Chinese did not vote with the Russians at the UN Security Council, and I'm making it very clear to China and other major nations of their responsibilities to protect sovereignty and self-determination of Ukraine, and we continue to put pressure on them.
Madam Ram.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary may be aware that last week I named 35 Russian oligarchs that are on the Navalny list. On top of that list was Roman Abramovich, who curiously a couple of days ago decided to transfer, or say out loud, he wanted to transfer Chelsea FC into some kind of trust. Now, the concern, of course, is that oligarchs are working with their lawyers and their accountants to do the same. Can she assure this House that we will not stop, we will follow the money, and no matter where their money may or may not be transferred to, we will find it and we will seize it?
Yeah. Well, I can assure the Honourable Lady that that is exactly what we are doing. We have a very large team of people working through our hit list of oligarchs, and we're also looking at their properties, their ownerships of yachts. We've already grounded their private jets. And my honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will be making a statement immediately after this about the Economic Crime Bill, which will give greater transparency about the opaque corporate structures operated by some of these people and organisations, and bringing much more clarity and sunlight.
Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend and all the team on their robust leadership in the course of this. It's brought a lot of cheer in the Ukraine. But my right honourable friend also spoke about chasing the oligarchs. We should remind everybody that the oligarchs are mostly in possession of Putin's own personal fortune, which is something in the order of $200 to $250 billion squirreled away through their accounts. But she will be hamstrung slightly because although we pursue the oligarchs and their money, it is still not mandatory, it is still not an offence for those who have worked for them, their lawyers, their estate agents and all the others, if they fail to give up the information about what are the deals that they have done. So can she now introduce in the bill, make it mandatory for all those in the chain, that if they fail to immediately, someone is sanctioned, to pass that information up directly, they will themselves be committing a criminal offence?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very good point, and we are absolutely looking at what we can do to target the families of oligarchs, the people that work for them, the people that support them, and the people that enable them, because ultimately all of these people are supporting the Putin regime, and we ultimately need to stop the financing of that regime.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will she name those London law firms who are sending her threatening letters to try to dissuade her from sanctioning Putin's cronies, who are also their clients?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that it doesn't dissuade me when people send me letters. It encourages me when people send me letters, and they are on our list.
Mark Pritchard.
The armed forces and people of Ukraine are fighting hard and fighting brave, and their courage is an inspiration to us all and all freedom-loving peoples around the world. On financial sanctions, can I commend the government and its lead in the West on those sanctions? But following on from the Shadow Secretary of State's comment on Visa, MasterCard and Diners Club, which of course are American companies, she mentioned phone calls. I have been on the phone this weekend to the US Congress, as she might expect. But can I ask her to get on the phone to Secretary Blinken to put pressure, perhaps for a temporary ban, in order that we not only have external pressure, but internal pressure too?
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend for his leadership of the APPG on Ukraine, and we will be doing more with our friendship group for the Ukrainians to raise international support behind the Ukrainian cause. I can tell him I have been on the phone to Tony Blinken on many occasions over the past few weeks. He's going to be travelling to Europe this week. I'll be meeting him. I'll also be in the United States the following week. And the UK does all it can to make sure the G7 is moving forward in all these areas of sanctions, including financial services, and we won't rest till we completely cut the Russian economy off, we cut it off from its supply of oil and gas money, and we make sure that Putin does not have the money to fund his war machine.
Sir Geoffrey Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Northern Ireland stand with the people of Ukraine, and we commend the government for giving a lead in the international community on many of these issues. The Foreign Secretary spoke of humanitarian assistance. Will that extend to the United Kingdom, opening its doors to some of the refugees from Ukraine?
Well, we are already donating 40 million additional of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. We're also providing direct support in the neighbouring countries, helping our friends, the Poles and the Slovaks, with the exodus of refugees from Ukraine. And my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has announced that we will be supporting the immediate families of British citizens here, and I understand what he is saying about further support for those refugees.
Jason McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spent yesterday afternoon with dozens of Huddersfield and Colne Valley's Ukrainian community with other political figures from the area. They really did welcome what we're doing on sanctions. They welcomed our humanitarian aid and our military support. But one of the many questions they're asking is obviously about visas. Can the Foreign Secretary please just reiterate the announcement that was made in the last hour about what it means for getting their family and loved ones back to the UK safely?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right. We have a very strong Ukrainian community right across the United Kingdom. We're determined to do all we can to support the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom and sovereignty. We are introducing the new Ukrainian humanitarian route, which just responds directly to the needs and asks of the Ukrainian government. And this means it gives British nationals and any person settled in the UK the ability to bring over their immediate Ukrainian family members. Through this extension alone, it will mean an additional 100,000 Ukrainians will be able to seek sanctuary in the United Kingdom. And I'm sure the Home Secretary will be outlining more details about the scheme in due course.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, I also want to say that I stand with Ukraine and support the Foreign Secretary in the measures that she's announced this afternoon, and to congratulate her on the unified way that she's doing that. But would you agree with me that the language we use is incredibly important in these very, very delicate times? And also, could you say anything about the Commonwealth and their involvement?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right. The language is very important. This war is not on behalf of the Russian people. This war has been instigated by President Putin, and I think it's very important that we focus on the personal agency he has had in mounting this unprovoked attack on Ukraine. I do understand there's a huge strength of feeling across the United Kingdom, and we are reflecting that in everything we do.
Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for the announcement that she and the Prime Minister has made about humanitarian relief, and can I urge her to join with other European countries in helping shoulder the financial burden of the humanitarian load of the frontline states. Most people who flee across the border want to stay as close as possible to the areas from which they have been driven. And all European countries must give the strongest support to those driven out in great fear and terror by this extraordinary and barbaric Russian behaviour.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the previous lady asked on the subject of our friends across the Commonwealth, and I can assure her that we are approaching friends across the Commonwealth to secure their support for the sanctions, for the strong stance against Russia, and supporting the Ukrainian people. On the subject of humanitarian relief in neighbouring countries, we've sent teams to Poland and Slovakia. We are supporting them. We've launched our campaign, and we are going to launch a further public appeal to secure further humanitarian donations. And in fact, I'm due to meet my Polish counterpart tomorrow in Geneva, and we'll be working very, very closely with our allies in Eastern Europe to support the people of Ukraine.
Ms. Savile-Roberts.
I welcome, of course, BP's decision to divest from Rosneft after I raised that very issue with the Prime Minister last week. International sanctions now include Russia's civilian aircraft fleet. The UK has a part to play in their enforcement, since as of yesterday, 713 leased Russian aircraft are registered in Bermuda, a British overseas territory. For far too long, weak UK regulation of Londongrad and tax haven overseas territories has enabled Putin's regime. What discussions has she had with British overseas territories to ensure the immediate, effective implementation of UK sanctions against Russia?
Well, like the Honourable Lady, I welcome BP's divestment that has taken place, and we're working closely with the overseas territories to make sure that Putin's oligarchs have nowhere to hide.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the sanctions regime needs to stay in place until every inch of Ukrainian territory is back in Ukraine control, including Crimea?
Yes, I completely agree with my honourable friend.
Marcia Corden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents are being affected by the war in Ukraine, and like me, they recognise the need for the toughest possible sanctions on Russia. Now, the Foreign Secretary's statement is welcome, but it didn't really go far enough. So can she tell the House now what steps she is actually taking to ensure that there will be sanctions imposed on extraction industries and also technology industries?
Well, what I announced today is that the export controls will apply to critical technology, so it will make it much harder to invest in those industries in Russia, oil and gas and technology, and of course the military-industrial complex. But she is right, the fundamental issue here is that Putin is reliant on oil and gas revenues, and that's where we need to work with our G7 partners. It's predominantly continental Europe that is dependent on oil and gas and coal from Russia, and we need to help them reduce that dependency so that Putin has nowhere to source his funds. And that's what we're doing through the G7.
Dr. Julian.
Mr. Speaker, as a matter of superior tactics, does my right honourable friend accept that the right way to deal with a robotic, sneering psychopath firmly in the grip of small man syndrome is not to impose sanctions in a piecemeal and gradually escalating way, but to seek to inflict maximum economic pain at the earliest possible moment?
Yes is the answer, and that is what we are doing. We are pushing as hard as we can for the toughest possible sanctions. This is the biggest package of sanctions the UK has ever put in place in our history, and we want to do even more, and we want to push it with our allies. Together with the G7, we represent half of the global economy, and that is what will really shift Putin's behaviour. That is what will really degrade the Russian economy and stop him being able to fund his war machine.
Justin Oswald.
Mr. Speaker,
listening to the Right Honourable Lady's comments, I'm not entirely sure yet what the hold-up potentially is with clarifying the plans to sanction Russia's political ruling class, members of the Duma, the Senate, the Presidential Council, the top echelons of security and defence services, and public television employees. And I wonder if she's able to set out for us a little bit more about how soon we might see that happen, given the need for action to be swift, decisive and clear.
Well, I can assure the Honourable Lady that we have a hit list of oligarchs, of Duma members, of those key personnel we're talking about, and we will be announcing those as we build the evidence and case against them. But we need those cases to be legally watertight. That's what's important, so that when we hit them, the hit sticks.
Sir John Redwood.
Will the government now allow and encourage more domestic production of oil and gas to help reduce the cruel dependence of Europe on Russian energy?
Well, we certainly are committed to using the UK's oil and gas fields. Energy independence is vitally important. We also need to invest more in nuclear, which my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, is working on.
Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I offer the Secretary of State a little bit of advice, because I have been in the House quite a bit of time. No one, can I congratulate, no one now likes oligarchs. But can I suggest that there's some very important, very substantial figures that we call oligarchs in London, in this country, and they actually are very intelligent and influential people on Putin. Would she agree with me that she should consult with them as a way of getting a voice of experience and reason to Putin in order that we could get a better resolution and a peaceful resolution of this horrible crisis?
Let's be absolutely clear here. This is unprovoked aggression by Putin after months of warning that there would be severe consequences and a long-running conflict. I do not believe that this is somebody who is capable of reason on that level at this stage. And what we have to be is we have to be tougher than tough. We have to be tough with our sanctions. We have to be tough with the military aid that we're supplying and our allies are supplying, because it is only strength that Vladimir Putin understands.
Liz Truss.
The UK and our allies have delivered meaningful economic strikes against Putin, but we now see the encirclement of civilian towns, the illegal and indiscriminate use of cluster weapons, Chechen militia for calling for more indiscriminate attacks. So can she please reassure me we will maintain maximum pressure, map and record all atrocities for future prosecution, but will she also commit to draw up plans for if we see the use of incendiary munitions or chemical weapons?
Well, my honourable friend is regrettably right that that is the type of action that we are seeing being contemplated. And everybody involved, including Putin's advisers, his generals, should be aware that the ICC is already looking at this. They're already looking at potential war crimes being committed. And we are urging a full investigation to take place.
Van Jones.
The Foreign Secretary for her statement. She talks about a hit list of oligarchs. Now, she knows as well as I do that there are individuals on that list, some that are well known, some that aren't so well known. The one thing they have in common is that they've all supported and continue to support Putin's regime. So can she tell me in terms of the timescale in dealing with some of these individuals? She says she wants more evidence. Well, surely we have the evidence against certain of those individuals. What timescale is she talking about when we will actually see lists of these individuals being printed and sanctions being taken?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've already announced over 120 businesses and oligarchs that have already been sanctioned. What I can tell him is there is a list that we are working through, and we will be announcing more as soon as the evidence is ready.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the resolute approach being taken by my right honourable friend and ask her whether she will consider secondary sanctions, that is to say sanctions not against Russian entities, but against entities in other countries that seek to profit from the gap left in trade. It is totally unacceptable for others to profiteer from this invasion, but also it will increase the pressure on Russia, as we know it did successfully on Iran.
Yes, we are looking at that, and my honourable friend is 100% right.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I sat on the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill and watched in horror as the Honourable Lady's party walked away from the opportunity to sanction Russia and the flow of dirty money through the UK. I'm sure with the benefit of hindsight, she and her party realised what a grave mistake that was. So will she now take the action? And the action she announces is welcome, but the action against Scottish limited partnerships, which are having a profound impact on many nations, and the secrecy havens that are the British overseas territories, notably the British Virgin Islands and the Isle of Man. Given her government's failure, surely these actions need to come now. Hear, hear.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady's welcome for the legislation, the economic crime bill that we will be introducing tomorrow, and my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will be saying more about this in his statement.
William Cash.
Would the Foreign Secretary confirm that the secondary legislation that's being introduced is now in the vote office or will be very soon? And secondly, would she also please confirm that the consequences of this legislation will be set out in clear and simple language from a practical point of view, so that the people who are affected by it, British businesses and the British individuals who are affected, can understand precisely what's happening in a clear and easily understood way?
Well, I can assure my honourable friend that it will be in the vote office as soon as possible. It's important that we get it absolutely right. And he talked about businesses being affected. There will be advice through the Export Support Service run by the Department of International Trade, making sure business have all the information they need.
Will my right honourable friend confirm that the Russian people are being consistently lied to by Russian state media, both in terms of the scale of Russia's military action and the loss of life that is taking place as a result? Does she agree that that makes the role of the BBC World Service and other trusted media all the more important? And will she bear that in mind when considering any calls for taking action against Russian state media in this country?
Well, my right honourable friend is entirely right. There is simply a pack of lies produced on Russian state media. And he's also right about the vital importance of the BBC World Service and other services that the Russian people can hear a more balanced version and truthful version of events from. And he's right about the consequences and the unintended consequences of preventing channels from operating in the UK, as there could be reciprocation, which would then make it harder for the Russian people to hear the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been overwhelmed with messages from constituents horrified about Russia's action in Ukraine. And this morning I visited Lewisham Polish Centre, who are doing brilliant work coordinating the local relief effort for those fleeing the country. But what everyone I've heard from has asked for is assurances that we're putting forward the strongest possible package of sanctions, providing humanitarian relief for refugees fleeing to neighbouring countries and offering comprehensive safe sanctuary routes to the UK. Can I press the Foreign Secretary to give us those reassurances today?
Foreign Secretary. I can reassure the Honourable Lady that we are doing all of those things. The sanctions that we currently have in place on Russia are the toughest sanctions the UK has put on any country or as a size of package in our entire history. But we are doing more. The important point is that we are working with our allies to do more every day.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Argyll constituents can't understand why we still allow Russian state-owned oil tankers to use UK ports. The Russian state-owned oil tanker NS Century is currently at the Finnart oil terminal in Loch Long, a port adjacent to Coolport, which is a home to the UK's nuclear arsenal. Why, when we're imposing such harsh economic sanctions on the Kremlin, are we continuing to allow Russian state-owned oil tankers to go freely about their business, particularly so close to this most sensitive military installation?
They won't be going about their business freely for much longer.
Bernard Jenkins.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for her statement. If the BBC World Service comes to her to ask for additional funding to increase the broadcasting in Russia and amongst Russia's supporting allies, will she entertain such requests and agree to them?
Well, I will certainly entertain the requests. I will make sure that they are value for money as well.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't understand why Abramovich and Usmanov has still not been included on the sanction list. I don't really understand why the Prime Minister said last Thursday that we weren't going to engage in cultural or sporting boycotts, because we certainly should. We should throw every single thing we've got at the Russians. And finally, I don't understand why the Prime Minister also said last Thursday that we're not going to be sending any Russian diplomats back home. Surely we should at least be cutting the Russian embassy here by a half or three-quarters, if not deciding that, frankly, the ambassador, who has lied through his teeth to this House, should go back home.
Well, as I said earlier, we have a hit list of oligarchs that we are working through. We are, and my right honourable friend, the Culture Secretary, is taking a very tough line on cultural activities, and we've seen a number of sporting events already cancelled.
Mr. Ridley.
Speaker, this is an incredibly tough time for the people of Ukraine, but it's also an incredibly nervous time for the people of the three Baltic states, who must undoubtedly feel that they themselves are at risk. These are good friends of the United Kingdom. They're people who have good relations with members across this House. Will she join me in sending a message to them that we are on their side, and will she do everything she can to make sure that we stand firmly alongside the Baltics in these nervous times?
My right honourable friend is correct. We know that Putin doesn't just want to take over Ukraine and restore Russian hegemony over Ukraine. We know that he wants to turn the clock back to the mid-1990s, where vast swathes of Eastern Europe were under Russian control. This is one of the many reasons why it's so important that his ambitions stop in Ukraine. This is why we're supporting the Ukrainians. It's also why we are increasing our strength on the Eastern flank. We've doubled the amount of troops into Estonia. Our allies are also stepping up to support the Baltic states, who are vital allies of the United Kingdom.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I welcome the sanctions set out by the Foreign Secretary and the words that she says about getting Putin's dirty money out of UK finance. But can we also get it out of UK politics? And would she support the Conservative Party handing back the £2 million from Russian oligarchs?
Mr. Speaker, there is a big difference between Russian people and supporters of the Putin regime, and it's important that we don't tar every single Russian, many of whom have gained British citizenship and who are part of our political process, with the same brush.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Hundreds of people rallied at Bolton Town Hall on Saturday. Outside of London, we have one of the most established Ukrainian diaspora communities in the UK. Will the FCDO agree to meet with the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain to discuss the UK's resolve for their friends and family? We are with them, and freedom will prevail.
We would be absolutely delighted to do that.
Tony Lloyd, Sir Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House should commend the Foreign Secretary's statement, but will she agree with me that with any sanctions regime, it is the detail that makes sure we can police it? And will she, in that light, look into the case of the plane of Mikhail Gutseriev, who is already sanctioned under Belarus sanctions, a friend of Putin, but whose plane itself was sanctioned by her predecessor, but landed, I'm told, twice at Luton Airport? This cannot be right.
Well, I will look into the case the honourable gentleman raises.
Listed back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the leadership that the UK has shown in developing international sanctions. But would my right honourable friend think about going a step further? At the moment, we are freezing assets of those sanctioned. Would she consider putting a charge onto those assets, monetising the charge now and using the money raised to pay for the support of refugees in Eastern Europe and ultimately to rebuild Ukraine?
Well, I thank the honourable lady for her very innovative idea, and I will certainly have a look at that.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. Will government be looking at addressing crypto assets, cryptocurrency, which may be utilised to try to mitigate the impact of some of the sanctions imposed? The all-party group of crypto and digital assets that I chair are very keen to play a responsible role and support government moving forward in that realm.
Well, we've worked very closely with the Treasury on this package of sanctions, and certainly we are looking at every possible route that could be used to undermine the sanctions and tackling it, and cryptocurrency is one of those.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. The rhetoric and the statements coming out of the Kremlin this weekend would appear to indicate that the invasion is not going to plan from the Russian perspective. Could my honourable friend please convince the House that the UK, the US and all of our allies will not blink when it comes to the global imperative to eject Russian forces from Ukraine, and also in the need to ensure that Ukraine is restored as quickly as possible to a free, democratic and proud nation?
I am very clear that there is a tough road ahead, and what I can say is that we are with the Ukrainian people. We know that this could last for some time. At yesterday's G7 foreign ministers, we were clear that the tough package of sanctions would increase. We're going to be doing more over the coming days and weeks, and we will continue to put pressure on the Kremlin. We will continue to supply the defensive weaponry into Ukraine to support them in their just cause of pursuing self-determination and sovereignty.
Florence Session-Loma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like members across this House, I've been contacted by Vauxhall residents who want to express their solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I attended Racial Justice Sunday Mass at the Church of the Holy Spirit, where a number of constituents raised with me the reports which the Secretary of State may have seen of African migrants in Ukraine trying to flee and being discriminated. The Secretary of State mentioned that she'll be meeting with her Polish counterpart in the next coming few days. Would she please raise the issue of those migrants in her discussions?
I'm happy to raise that issue.
Craig Whittaker.
Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend
who I know has worked tirelessly along with the Prime Minister over the last few weeks to do all they can to help stop the regime of Putin. Particularly around sanctions. But would my honourable friend agree, though, that it's vital that we continue to work to plug the holes in our sanctions regime, which allows Putin to ship oil from this country? And I wonder if she could say whether there's anything legally we can do to stop that ship that's currently up in the Orkneys waiting to ship oil.
I am looking very closely at this with my colleague, the Transport Secretary, to get this addressed as soon as possible.
Carmichael.
Thank you. I have to tell the Foreign Secretary that time is not on her side. The NS Challenger is due to berth at 6 a.m. on Wednesday. Now, in the last hour, the Secretary of State for Transport has written to all UK ports requesting them not to grant access to Russian vessels. That's a very welcome move, but the House will have noticed that he used the word in request rather than instruct. Yep. So can the Foreign Secretary tell me now, or get me early information, that if the terminal operators at Flotta in Orkney refuse to berth the NS Challenger, that they will not be left financially exposed as a result?
Yeah.
I'm looking at this issue urgently with the Transport Secretary, and I will get back to the honourable gentleman with that information.
Jane Stevenson.
Speaker, when parliamentarians in this place see our counterparts in Ukraine taking up arms to defend their country, it is really sobering. Does she agree that it is vital we send that united and clear message that we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, even if that is for the long haul, and this is a war that Putin cannot win?
We have seen the acts of incredible bravery from the Ukrainian population, from Ukrainian politicians, including President Zelensky, who has led from the front, and it is absolutely inspiring. And our message across the House today should be that however long it takes, however difficult it is, whatever the difficulties we have economically, they cannot compare to the sheer hell the people of Ukraine are going through. And we will be with them through thick and thin until Putin loses and until the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine is restored.
Liam Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will have welcomed the Foreign Secretary's ambition this afternoon, but can we speed up the process of hitting the people on the hit list? There are 23 people on the EU sanctions list who are not on the UK sanction list as of this morning. The ban on trading in state bonds is in place in Europe, but not in the UK. The ban on import and export from breakaway regions is in place in Europe, but not in the UK. The asset freeze and travel ban on Duma members is in place in Europe, but not in the UK. The asset freeze and travel bans in place in Europe, number 22, and just 8 in the UK, announced in the last few days. What further power and resources does the Foreign Secretary need in order for us to catch up with our American and European allies?
Well, we are leading from the front. There are many. So, for example, we are banning clearing from Sberbank, which the EU aren't doing at the moment. We are freezing more bank assets. We have advocated the SWIFT ban, and we want to get all of our allies to agree to a SWIFT ban. But this is not a competition between us and our allies. This is a concerted endeavour where all of us are doing all we can, as quickly as can, to show unity and deliver a massive hit to the Russian economy. And you've seen the drop in the ruble today, Mr. Speaker. You've seen the impact this unity is having. And I strongly encourage colleagues across the House to support our package, which is unprecedented in United Kingdom history, to, of course, put pressure on more countries to join us. But there are areas where we are going a lot further than our allies. There are some areas where they have gone further than us. But what we need to do is continue to make progress together. That is what sends a strong message to Putin.
I'd like to pay tribute to the bravery of the Ukrainian people. But change often begins at home. And in this particular case, Alexei Navalny is currently incarcerated the leader of the opposition in prison in Russia. Would the Foreign Secretary agree with me that there should be stronger calls for him to be released so that democracy can truly flourish in Russia once again?
Well, my honourable friend is correct about Navalny, and he ought to be released. And we've seen a terrible suppression of democracy. We've also seen a terrible suppression of information in Russia. But despite that, we're seeing people in Russia come out on the streets. We're seeing public figures speak out against the regime, and that takes incredible bravery. And I congratulate and I'm humbled by the people in Russia who are prepared to risk their lives to stand up for freedom.
Kerry McCarthy.
Mr. Speaker, following on from that, we know how ruthless Putin can be when it comes to internal opposition. Yesterday was the 7th anniversary of the murder of Boris Nemtsov. Navalny's in prison. I myself went out for the trial of Pussy Riot some years ago. What are we doing to offer support to people that will come under increased repression in Russia? We may not be able to directly support them, but what are we doing to try to bolster their courage and make sure that they keep up the opposition to Putin?
Well, we have always worked to support those who speak out in favour of free speech, free media and democracy in Russia, and we continue to do that. And we congratulate those who are prepared to go out and protest against this regime's appalling actions. And our concerns are not with the Russian people. Our concerns are with Vladimir Putin and his regime.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I warmly welcome the leadership shown and the progress made by the Foreign Secretary and the government with partners on intensifying economic sanctions. The announcements from Switzerland and Singapore were particularly important. What more does my right honourable friend think that we can do to persuade the countries of the United Arab Emirates to stand up more strongly for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity against unwarranted aggression?
Well, I've had a phone call with my UAE counterpart making exactly those points. And every country around the world should be aware that if this is allowed to happen, if a country, because it's bigger and mightier, is allowed to invade a sovereign democracy with impunity, then this could happen anywhere. So this is about Ukraine and its sovereignty and democracy. This is about the security of Europe. But this is also about global security and global rules. And that is why every single country, including non-democracies, should care about making sure that Putin loses in Ukraine.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased the Foreign Secretary has urged Russia to enable safe passage for civilians to flee the violence. But does she recognise that her own government has to do far more to offer sanctuary to those fleeing? Limiting it to immediate family members simply isn't good enough. The elderly grandmother of my constituent has been granted a UK visa, but has been told that she has to travel 300 miles from Kyiv to Lviv to get the visa actually stamped in her passport. Now, I raised it with the Foreign Secretary last week. She told me to contact the Home Office. I have contacted the Home Office to no avail. Since this relates to the operation of the embassy, can she help? And can she assure us that this won't be a repeat of the Afghanistan crisis, where honourable members were bounced between the Home Office and the Foreign Office with very little success? Meanwhile, our constituents suffered.
Well, our ambassador, who is in Lviv, is doing a fantastic job in very difficult circumstances. And we are doing all we can to support people in Ukraine. As I've said, this case is a matter for the Home Office. I'm very happy to take the case and make sure the Home Secretary is aware of it.
Jonathan Chudovsky.
I realised that the government really understood the nature of sanctioning oligarchs when the sanctions on Aeroflot were extended to private jets. In that vein, will my right honourable friend now consider banning insurance for Russian yachts and jets, which will be worldwide application and make life a lot tougher for those concerned?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his idea, and nothing is off the table.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr.
Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Foreign Secretary said about banning airlines, Russian airlines, and banning Russian ships from docking at our ports. But just yesterday afternoon, we had a Russian-owned and Russian-crewed ship heading from Inverness down to Humber to dock. And I know the Foreign Secretary has made clear she's in discussions with the Transport Secretary, but I wonder if she can give some indication when we will have sanctions to stop that happening, because there was a huge amount of local opposition in the Humber to that ship.
Well, the local opposition is right, and we are working as fast as we can to deal with this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend and her team for all the amazing work they're doing in the face of this appalling invasion. With this worrying resurgence of both Russia and China, does my right honourable friend agree with me the best way to combat this and to reassure other countries is not only to invest in our own defence, but in our diplomatic reach around the world, so we can spread our values of democracy and freedom and proclaim them even more loudly?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes, well, that sounds like a petition to the Chancellor, which I wholly agree with, about the Foreign Office's budget, and I very much support that. And he is right. You know, this horrific invasion is a massive wake-up call to the West about our defence and the need to invest in NATO. And one thing I'm very pleased to see is Germany committing to 2% of its GDP into NATO. We need to see everybody commit to that, and we need to look at what more we can do to strengthen NATO, because we have taken European security for granted and we can't do that any longer.
Samuel Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, I first of all congratulate the Foreign Secretary in the role which she has played in the collective effort which the government has made in seeking to show President Putin that his actions will not be tolerated, and the fact that some countries which a week ago were not contemplating strict sanctions are now doing so, I think is an important step. Just on the sanctions, I understand that the Foreign Secretary has to go through the legislative process, she's got to do the investigations of the people who are going to be targeted, etc. But many of them are named in the statement today. Many of them will guess who they are. And is she not concerned that where there are assets which are mobile or assets which can be quickly hidden, that the action will be taken to avoid those sanctions?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that the ones named in the statements are either in our legislation or have already been sanctioned. And the point about working with our allies across the world is these people and organisations will have nowhere to hide.
Yes. Ciara Mullen, Dr. Ciara Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. India is a great friend of the UK and a leading democracy, and Indian communities prosper in democracies around the world, including, of course, in this country. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's in India's long-term interest to do everything they possibly can to ensure this invasion fails?
Foreign Secretary.
That is absolutely correct. Every sovereign nation who believes in fair play and the rule of law around the world should be doing all they can to stop Putin being successful in Ukraine. And that includes India, it includes China, it includes every other country around the world.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Somebody had a grandparent born and raised in Ukraine. This war does come emotionally quite close to me and everybody of Ukrainian descent in this country. During the 1990s onwards, British headquartered legal, finance, audit, risk companies have helped create the kleptocracy that exists in Russia. Many of them still have huge offices in Moscow, like KPMG, PwC, Linklaters and Ernst & Young actually put Rosneft on the London Stock Exchange. What action is she taking for British companies to withdraw from Russia, to withdraw their support from the kleptocracy that exists funding the war machine, and to delist some Russian companies on the stock exchange?
Secretary.
Well, we are running through a list, and we've already sanctioned over 120 businesses in Russia and oligarchs. We've prevented the Russian central bank from deploying its international reserves to counteract sanctions. We're freezing bank assets in vast parts of the Russian economy. And we will continue to do more to target individual companies with freezes and sanctions. As I said, Nothing is off the table. We're working in train with our allies on all of this.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Foreign Secretary and the Government on the swift action they've taken, including the action against the Russian Central Bank, and commend her on her work to go further. But frankly, isn't it desperate and indeed pitiful to try to blame words from Her Majesty's Government for the Russian outrageous escalation of dangerous rhetoric yesterday? Because the truth is that it is imperative for the stability of the international order that Putin fails.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my right honourable friend is right. The reality is Putin has made these threats in order to distract from his unprovoked invasion into Ukraine. And the reason that we are being targeted is because the UK has been leading on measures to both support Ukraine and degrade the Russian economy. And they don't like it.
Sam Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Early on, we've got an unfortunately opaque response. And our response was opaque to the member for Lancaster and Fleetwood on oligarchs' financing of the Conservative Party. The honourable member for Lock Harbour has also raised this question of £2.3 million of donations. So I wonder if the Foreign Secretary would like to take this opportunity to commit today to giving that money from Russian oligarchs directly to charities that will be supporting Ukrainian refugees, hopefully not picking vegetables, but in this country in safety.
Foreign Secretary.
As I've said, we cannot tar every single person of Russian origin with the same brush. We are targeting oligarchs close to Putin without fear or favour. We are freezing bank assets without fear or favour, and we will continue to do that.
Peter Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for coming to the House to update us. I understand today the Foreign Secretary has banned travel from the United Kingdom to Russia. Have we also asked British citizens in Russia to return? And could you absolutely confirm that there is nothing off the table economically, diplomatically or militarily?
Foreign Secretary.
So we have moved our travel advice on Russia to red, which means we advise against all travel. That is not the same as a ban. It is ultimately government advice, but I strongly advise people not to go to Russia. That is very clear. On the subject of the wider issue, nothing is off the table on sanctions. We're absolutely clear about that. We're pushing our G7 allies as hard as we can to get a full ban on SWIFT, to get a full ban on all bank assets, to reduce dependence on oil and gas, which is ultimately the most important economic lever over Putin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last 8 years there has been a war. It's not been the last few days. And during that time, it's not just been in military warfare, but it's also been one of communications known as a hybrid warfare. Yesterday, the EU decided to shut down RT and Sputnik. So can the Foreign Secretary confirm that where she's leading in some areas, will she follow the EU and shut down RT and Sputnik immediately? Simply because yesterday, as I was watching it, there was a documentary completely about the Nazification in 2014 Crimea, which is wholly untrue, and it's been put on the television screens today.
Secretary.
We are looking at what can be done on RT, but the reality is that if we ban RT in the United Kingdom, that is likely to lead to channels like the BBC being banned in Russia. And what we want is we want the Russian population to hear the truth about what Vladimir Putin is doing. So there is a very careful judgment to be made, and that is something the Culture Secretary is looking at.
I'm here. She's meant to speak through me, not through the members. Sally Ann Hart, when you answer through the chair.
The vast majority of Russian people are like us. They want to earn money, provide for their families and be happy. But their president, Mr. Putin, has taken them down a very dark path and the world to the brink. Would my right honourable friend join me in urging the Russian people and those in the Kremlin who do not agree with Mr. Putin to do whatever it takes to bring back Russia from the brink and stop Putin?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my honourable friend that we need to do all we can to stiffen the resolve of those in Russia who are disgusted by President Putin's actions in their name. And this is why it's important that we do reach out through channels like the BBC, that we are communicating very clearly, and the Foreign Office has recently stood up our information unit, which provides communications to challenge the disinformation from the Putin regime.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent's wife and child are currently fleeing the violence in Ukraine, and they hope to return home. But her sister, who is Ukrainian, and her 2 children, aged 10 and 4, are fleeing with them because the home they had been living in was destroyed by a Russian bomb. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that this is precisely the kind of case where the United Kingdom, with a long history of compassion and welcome to refugees, should be enabling this family together to return to the United Kingdom?
Well, it's appalling about the horrific situation that your constituents' family find themselves in. And we do need to be welcoming to refugees from this appalling, unpremeditated war created by Vladimir Putin. And I will take your inquiry onto the Home Office and get you a response.
Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, some 4 years ago, there was an inquiry announced into the progress of golden visas, which had been potentially misallocated. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that anybody who is on her list, and I commend her on her ever-growing list of oligarchs that she is sanctioning, anybody on that list who becomes sanctioned will have any golden visas that they may have been granted in the past summarily revoked?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, they won't be able to travel.
The Georgides family, the Recon family, and many others in my constituency have family members and loved ones who are now in Poland or on the border of Poland. They want to know what conversations the Foreign Secretary has had with her counterpart in Poland about swift flights to bring those family members to the UK, and perhaps just as much of importance, what conversations she's had with the Home Secretary on that matter.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman that we have been working closely with the Home Office on this issue, as well as the Polish government. I'm in fact due to meet the Polish Minister tomorrow to discuss this further, but we have a forward team of Foreign Office officials in Poland precisely to help these cases.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the additional government measures announced today, but will the Foreign Secretary also recognise and indeed encourage the actions of UK individuals and companies who have chosen to dispose of investments and shareholdings in Russian companies, not least the BP's disposal of its stake in Rosneft, which will, of course, come at a substantial cost to its shareholders?
Foreign Secretary.
I do welcome the actions by companies who are dissociating themselves from working with the Putin regime, including BP's divestment.
Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. We've all witnessed the horrifying war crimes that are taking place against the people of Ukraine, and one would have thought, would they not, that there would at least have been some diplomatic expulsions in coordination with others as a result of that. But the Foreign Secretary sort of dodged a question from my good friend from Rutland and Melton. Is her department working on plans should those war crimes get worse and chemical weapons are deployed against the people of Ukraine?
The answer is yes, we are working on that. We're working very closely with the ICC. The Chief Prosecutor has already issued a statement about the situation in Ukraine, and we are determined that everybody in Russia close to Putin, who is in charge of this appalling invasion, should be aware that they could be prosecuted for war crimes for what they're doing. And of course, on diplomatic expulsions, we don't rule anything out, and we're working closely with our allies.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's robust statement on further sanctions on Russia and strong support for Ukraine. Deliberate misinformation and propaganda are part of Putin's toolbox. So does she agree with me that whilst, of course, we must safeguard and respect free speech, social media companies have a responsibility to ensure they are not propagating lies and must moderate the content on their platforms extremely carefully?
Foreign Secretary.
The honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, is right, and the Culture Secretary is looking very closely at the activities of the social media companies.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to hear the Foreign Secretary is not going to be cowed by letters from oligarchs' lawyers, and she will know that no matter how distasteful we might find it and how damaging it might be to these firms' reputations, even these oligarchs are entitled to legal representation, because that is part of what makes us a free and democratic society. But will she agree with me that the best way to deal with these issues is to ensure that the laws are watertight in the first place? So can she give us an assurance that she's getting the best and the most expert lawyers available to ensure that there are no loopholes that can be exploited?
I can tell the honourable gentleman that the Foreign Office is currently full of lawyers working through precisely this point.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I very much welcome the robust global leadership that the UK has shown against Putin's Russia. The high dependency on Russian energy in parts of Europe has been used by Putin to threaten many of those European countries. So what more can the British government be doing to help support those European countries to reduce that dependency?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm working very closely with my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, on helping those countries reduce their dependence, working with the G7. So over time, there is less and less oil and gas and coal imported from Russia, so there is less money to fund Putin's war machine.
Drew Hendry.
Mr Speaker, the public would rightly expect the departments of the Cabinet to be working together at a time like this. The Foreign Secretary said in her statement, "We are also leading on humanitarian support." Yet, fleeing Ukrainian citizens seeking refuge in the UK are being denied entrance because of outdated and restrictive immigration rules. So will the Foreign Secretary urge her Cabinet colleagues to follow the EU nations in waiving visa requirements for Ukrainian citizens for 3 years?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, as I said earlier, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has just announced the new Ukrainian humanitarian route, which does respond directly to these needs.
Mr Speaker, the Foreign Secretary announced the launching of a joint task force to hunt down the assets of oligarchs hit by our sanctions. Can she tell us the speed and scale of which that task force will be set up, and what conversations have been had with the insurance companies, who presumably have a list of all the assets and names of the individuals?
Secretary.
Well, this really pertains to a number of questions that have been asked. What we are doing in building up our evidence cases about the oligarchs is sharing information with our G7 allies. So we're working together, we're getting that information quicker. That work is already underway, that task force already exists. And of course, alongside the legal services, the PR services, the accountancy services, we will be looking at the insurance services that these oligarchs rely on. So this is all about being able to do this quicker, because every single country has the same issue. The US take time to build up cases against oligarchs because generally their organisations are so complex and opaque. And the work that my right honourable friend is doing on the economic crime bill will also help making it easier for us to understand their corporate structures.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think all of us, particularly those of us who were members of the House in September 2001, realise that a page has been turned in world history and a new chapter has begun that will resonate not just now but for many years. And the important thing is that our shared values are the way that we respond in the months and years to come. On the specifics of her statement, she did say over 50% of Russian trade is denominated in dollars or sterling. But so that the House can understand the impact of our government's actions, how much of Russian trade is denominated in sterling?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I don't have that figure on me, but I can get it to the honourable gentleman. The point I was making is the action we've taken on clearing is in conjunction with the United States. So between us, we are able to cover 50% of that trade.
Tricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Foreign Secretary explain why the Russian ambassador to the UK has yet to be dismissed? And will she do all she can to encourage the governments of all Western democracies and the wider international community to similarly dismiss their Russian ambassadors in order to further underscore the isolation of Russia under Putin on the international stage?
Foreign Secretary.
It's very important in all that we do that we work with allies, and coordinated action is vital to send a message to Russia and the rest of the world. And as I've said, nothing is off the table.
Dave Duggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to the Foreign Secretary correctly detail the importance of avoiding sanctions leakage, and she was asked twice in this statement about British overseas territories. I detected a reluctance to go into detail on that. If I was wrong, can she please correct me? And if I was right, can she explain why?
Foreign Secretary.
I've been very clear that we will absolutely be including overseas territories in all of these measures we're taking.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. The sister of my constituent, Mrs. Roach from Command, has been travelling across Ukraine with her children for 3 days in an attempt to get to the Polish border. So based on what she said earlier, because it's not clear to me, will my constituent's sister and her children qualify as immediate family in order to get obtain access to the UK?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, that is a matter for the Home Office, and I'm very pleased to raise the honourable gentleman's case with the Home Secretary.
Last but not least, Margaret Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The World Health Organization have warned that oxygen supplies are running dangerously low in Ukraine and that they're working with international partners to get urgent shipments through Poland. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm what medical aid the UK government is providing to Ukraine to help them maintain essential services?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I discussed this issue with my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, this morning. We do have a shipment of medical supplies, or rather a cargo of medical supplies, and our Ministry of Defence is helping facilitate that into Ukraine.
We now come to the next statement. Kwasi Tang, Business Secretary.
Well done, well done. Great. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, sir, I would like to make a statement on reforms the government will be bringing forward to improve transparency over the ownership of companies and property in the UK and to strengthen the enforcement of financial sanctions. These are the key elements of our strategy to tackle dirty money from Russia and from elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, the openness of our economy to investment from all parts of the world is one of our greatest strengths. However, we are equally determined that we want to attract the right kind of investment. And as many people in this House will know, oligarchs and kleptocrats from Russia and elsewhere have used the veneer of legitimacy provided by UK-registered companies and partnerships. And they have also used high-end property to help launder proceeds of corruption. At present, Mr. Speaker, Companies House has very limited powers to prevent this abuse. In light of Russia's outrageous actions in recent days, it is necessary that we put these criminals on notice and send a clear message that the UK will not tolerate their corruption here. So to that end, I am announcing 2 immediate steps. Firstly, today my department is publishing a white paper on corporate transparency and register reform, and this white paper sets out a comprehensive package of reforms to Companies House. There's a white paper, just stop preempting, just be very patient. The agency will be transformed into a custodian of accurate and detailed information, ensuring that we can clamp down on those who seek to abuse UK corporate structures to launder money. Anyone setting up, running, owning or controlling a company in